Good morning, and thank you for joining us on the SAG-AFTRA live stream on YouTube. To stay informed about all of our live stream and video events, we invite you to subscribe to this channel. You can go ahead and do that right now. Today, we present the President's Task Force on Education, Outreach, and Engagement live stream, Stacey Abrams on Fighting for Voter Rights. We'll be pausing throughout as we have with us Destiny Bradford and Brenda Terry. They are here today to translate into American Sign Language all of the programming. Destiny and Brenda will be switching off periodically throughout today's discussion. The presentation will begin momentarily. If you have questions that you'd like to direct to today's guests, please email pteoe@sagaftra.org. That's pteoe@sagaftra.org. We've already received a lot of questions and we'll get as many in as we can. As a reminder, today's program is being recorded and you can watch the replay right here on SAG-AFTRA's YouTube channel, along with a lot more great content. Now, please give a very warm welcome to today's hosts, SAG-AFTRA President Gabrielle Carteris and SAG-AFTRA National Executive Director David White.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Oh, I am so excited about today's discussion. It's an incredibly reflective and important to today's environment, to our ability to ensure that all Americans have the right to vote. We put together an important conversation for you today as we have with us Stacey Abrams, founder of Fair Fight Action, and we're so happy you could be with us, Stacey. Thank you. Our National Executive Director, David White, is joining me as co-host for today's program. And we also have with us Executive Vice President Rebecca Damon, who will be joining us for Q&As at the end. You know, as a union, we've always stood for civil and human rights, and we are still fighting today to ensure that all voices count, that all voices are heard. Our predecessor unions actually took an important role in civil rights, voters' rights, anti-discrimination efforts. Actually, in 1963, it was Harry Belafonte, Paul Newman, Sidney Poitier, SAG's second vice president, Charles Heston, and other SAG and AFTRA members who joined Dr. Martin Luther King in the 1963 March on Washington. New election laws are being introduced in Georgia and other parts of the country that affect American freedoms, equal opportunity, and fair representation at the polls. The time to fight voter suppression is now. So I want to remind everybody that SAG-AFTRA is nonpartisan. We do not endorse or donate to political candidates or political parties. That being said, this is not a partisan issue. It is an issue of our constitutional rights as Americans. The union opposes any effort to suppress the voting rights of Americans, especially our members. The Screen Actors Guild was there for the landmark legislation on civil rights. SAG President Dana Andrews represented the Guild at President Johnson's conference at the White House, relating to the role labor can play in support of the newly signed Civil Rights Act of 1964. So we encourage SAG-AFTRA members everywhere to make yourselves heard. Stand up against injustices and support laws designed to level the playing field. David, I know you want to say a few words, so please do.
I do, Gabrielle. Thank you. And Stacey, it's really great for you to take time out of your busy schedule to be here with us. The work that you are doing is so incredible. And I don't know if people know, the work that you do that is frequently commented upon is your work in your political space, but you have done so much over a relatively short career. People may not know that you are an author of romantic suspense novels, that you've been a tax attorney, that you've been an entrepreneur and a CEO. So we're grateful to have you here. And of course, today's conversation will focus on voting rights and voter suppression. Mostly, we're going to get to a number of topics, but I do want to anchor us very briefly in those issues just by talking a little bit about the past and what brought us here. Most people need to know that there was once a time when not everybody had voting rights. All the way back in 1870, when the 15th Amendment was ratified to prohibit states from denying a male citizen the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. All the way back then, and it wasn't until 1920 when the 19th Amendment granted some women the right to vote, but excluded women of color across various ethnic groups. And then it wasn't until 45 years later, when the Voting Rights Act of 1965 came, that discriminatory voting practices were outlawed and adopted in many Southern states after the Civil War, including literacy tests as a prerequisite to voting.
Wow.
So here we are today, still fighting to ensure these rights do not roll back after 56 years. And here's the truth, we're still fighting. And Stacey, you've been at the forefront of that fight. So we really appreciate your being here and your willingness to engage in this conversation with us.
Yes. Teaching us to fight to be better. So let's get right to it. Stacey Abrams actually served 11 years in the Georgia House of Representatives, 7 as minority leader, and was the 2018 Democratic nominee for governor of Georgia. She is the founder of Fair Fight Action, Fair Count, and the Southern Economic Advancement Project, organizations devoted to voting rights and tackling policy and social issues. She has received degrees from Spelman College, the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, and Yale Law School. You are very prolific, definitely so much going on there. So please, it's so good to see you, Stacey. Thank you again for being with us.
Yes, and Stacey, so we've read your resume. Everyone knows that you're great, right? And there's been a documentary. I don't know if people have seen it. It's on Amazon Prime. It's called All In: The Fight for Democracy. So you're also a member of our tribe, our community here in the entertainment industry. And recently, Stacey, there's just been a great deal of attention to the success that you've had in your recent efforts to ensure that as many people as possible had voting rights. So the first question is just, how are you? Are you feeling the impact of the success of your efforts and where all this has led?
Well, first of all, Gabrielle and David, thank you so much. And thank you to Destiny and to her ASL partner for the work you're going to do today. I'm grateful for the success we've had, but given this area of work that I endeavor to pursue, they try to make sure I'm constantly on my toes. I spent 4 hours yesterday in a hearing in the U.S. Senate discussing these laws and why they are problematic. In fact, problematic is too kind a word. Why they could be devastating to the ability of communities of color to participate in our democracy, and why that should worry everyone. So I'm pretty good, but I would love to have a week where this is not the conversation we need to be having, where we're not talking about voting rights and the basic protections. My mission is for us to be talking about who we're electing and not whether people can participate in our democracy.
So important. Oh my God. And when you say you would like a week without that, I'm thinking I would like to hopefully be able for us to fight the fight so that we can end it for decades and centuries to come. This is definitely been ongoing for us. So,
and hey, Gabrielle, I don't know if you're going to, let me just do a quick follow-up. So we are still talking about it, and there are still efforts around the country to continue to suppress voting rights. But you did something very special in Georgia that people look to as a model to get people out to ensure that they protected those rights. Can you describe just a little bit about the recent effort that you had that achieved a great deal of success?
So I want to contextualize it because it feels like it happened overnight to so many people, because if you listen to stories about the South and particularly about Georgia, it seemed not only unusual, but impossible that Georgia would have changed its political dynamic so dramatically in a single year. But the reality is, for the last 10 years, my work has really focused on engaging communities that are marginalized, that are disadvantaged, that simply did not believe that their political power was real. And we worked on getting them registered. But registration is the start. It's also about education. It's like handing someone the keys to a car. But if you've never had a driving lesson, then those keys can be fairly irrelevant. And then it's actually making sure they get a car. And so it's doing the registration, the education, the engagement, and then getting them on the road. And that's the work that we did over the course of a decade. And I am proud to have been a part of it and to have had a cheerleading role and a leading role in helping organize it, but it was so many different people. What is, I think, so important about that work is that it demonstrated that communities that are often discounted as a relevant part of our democracy showed their power, and they were able to change the outcome of an election. Sadly, it is that very act of democratic engagement, and I say Democrat with a small d, that act of engagement as a citizen that has led to this backlash and this attempt to expand voter suppression at, just an exponential pace. Right now, we see more than 360 bills in 47 states. By some estimates, this is almost 7 times more than the bills that were introduced in 2020 in an election year. And the causality is incredibly clear and stark. And it is young people, people of color, and young people of color that are largely the targets of these bills, but people of color in particular have been the most aggressive and longstanding targets of these suppressive actions.
It's go ahead, Gabrielle.
No, go on.
So you just said something, and I had read that before, that these bills are now proliferating throughout 47 states. I mean, everywhere. So as soon as there was success, activity automatically went and spread out across the country. Why is it so difficult when we have it right here in our face? We can read about it on the front page of the New York Times. It's out in the open. Why is it still so difficult to combat these efforts?
So you actually alluded to it with your opening comments. Voter suppression is baked into the DNA of America. When our nation was created, it explicitly excluded people of color. So it said Black people weren't human. It said Native Americans could not be citizens. It treated women as non-existent. Only white men had the right to vote, and even they, by practice, could only vote if they owned property. So only 6% of white men, 6% of Americans could vote, and they were exclusively white men. The Nationality Act of 1790, and I may misname it, but in 1790, there was an act passed that said that only white people of good character could ever be naturalized to be citizens in the United States. So from its very inception, every community of color and women were pushed out of participation. Over the course of time, every time we have seen any advancement, there has been an immediate backlash. And with the 15th Amendment, Black men were given the right to vote. And as a result, we saw Black men get elected to governorships, to the Senate, to the US House. And by 1790, we had Jim Crow laws, and we had this, 1877, we had this backlash that essentially nullified Black voting for 150 years. Native American women got the right to vote in 1920, but that was only white women. Native Americans, period, did not become citizens of the United States until 1924. And even then, they were still precluded from voting in most of the places where they lived. And so every time we have seen an advancement of communities that have been ostracized from participation, when they get to join, the people in power who kept them out become very afraid of their presence. And the automatic response, almost the autonomic response, has been voter suppression. It's happened. Federalists did it, Democrats did it, and in current time, Republicans are doing it. So this is not about assigning blame based on partisanship. It is assigning blame based on power. The parties that are in power who face the greatest harm from participation are the most likely ones to engage in voter suppression, because it is much easier to stop someone from participating than it is to convince them to support your ends. And unfortunately, in politics, the easy way out is to simply block access as opposed to expand opportunity.
Talk about some of the things when you're talking about blocking access in terms of voting, because I think people aren't very clear about what that might mean.
So let's start from a basis of the other constitutional problem that we have is that the Constitution of the United States does not create a single democracy where everyone gets the same rights no matter where you live. We have a democracy based on geography, because Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution delegates to the states the right to administer elections. And so the quality of your participation differs based on the state you live in. And so in present day, when you hear about voter suppression laws, what's happening is that you are seeing laws that are either taking back rights that people have enjoyed. So in Georgia, for example, Georgia actually has on its face really good laws. We have no excuses absentee voting. We have automatic registration. We were allowed to vote on Sundays in certain counties. We had weekend voting. We have 3 weeks of early voting. What this bill did, SB 202, is try to constrict many of those efforts. So we still have no excuses absentee voting, but unlike the past 15 years, you now have to send in proof of your identity, which sounds innocuous until you realize you don't know who's getting that proof. You don't know how long that piece of paper is going to lay around. And it's going to be in an envelope so that anyone who wants to steal your identity knows where to go and look. In fact, they know the 3 weeks they need to go shopping for your identity. That's a problem. They eliminated hours of voting that for a lot of people who work 9 to 5, they used to be able to vote from 7 to 7 during that 3 week early voting period. They've now constricted it because in the last election, more people of color used it as a percentage of their portion of the electorate. More people of color use those voting opportunities, and so they're taking them back. Likewise, they've shortened the amount of time you have to apply for an absentee ballot. They've changed the rules for how you can send it back. They've eliminated 300 hours of Dropbox opportunities, largely used by people who couldn't rely on the post office because that was weaponized. And so in Georgia, that's what's happening. Go a few states over in Texas, they are trying to eliminate access to voting because in the county that had the strongest participation by communities of color, they're trying to make it illegal for many of those opportunities to still exist. In Arizona, they're attempting to eliminate what's called it's PEVL, but it's their permanent early voting list. You get on that list, you can go early vote anytime you need to. If they eliminate it, that can take 200,000 people off of this list, 20% of whom are anticipated to be Latino. You have a number of Native Americans who use this list. And so across the country, we're seeing it in Wisconsin and in Pennsylvania and in Michigan and in 47 states. Not every state's going to move these bills, but we know in states where Republicans have control, we are seeing these bills move with great speed. They've passed in Montana just recently and in Iowa and in Georgia. And so what I want people to understand is that the way these laws are written, they're going to respond to the existing laws in that state, and they will usually try to make those laws harder to meet. They will erect new barriers to participation, and by and large, they will do their best to eliminate access or at least limit access so that the people who were inconvenient to those who were elected in the last cycle, they won't have an opportunity to come back and do it again.
And I mean, it's devastating, the comprehensive nature of what you've described. And you can take Georgia, and that seems like it's something of a template.
Yes.
And it happens, the election happens, and within weeks, 47 states have legislation that is using similar language, but it's applied specifically to the details of legislation within that state. My question is, that's coming from somewhere. There are people who are thinking about how to suppress laws and to then distribute that broadly and make sure that the right legislators have it in their hands and can introduce it quietly now in the period of time when we're all focused on other things. And then it becomes the law prior to the next election. Who on the side of people who want to expand voting rights is doing similar work in anticipation of something that, as you say, has been happening since the dawn of the Republic?
So right now, we know that Heritage Action has been celebrating these bills. They are a conservative organization that has been known to proliferate in cooperation with an organization called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and they tend to put together and distribute fairly conservative legislation, and they get it to all of the state legislatures that will lift them up. And on the progressive side, there are organizations that are trying to protect the rights. And so we're seeing in states that have already who are committed to voter access and voter expansion, you are seeing states like New Jersey take important steps forward. New Jersey did not have early voting. They now have it. They may not have as many days as we would like, but it was an important step forward that they're adding it. We're seeing the state of New York improve their voting rights because for many years they've had constraints on it that were problematic. But part of what I need people to remember, and we had a debate about this yesterday in the Senate hearing, is that it's not just what the laws are, It's what precipitated the law's existence and what are creating the law's changes. And in the states where we are the most concerned about what we call Jim Crow laws, it is that Jim Crow was designed to use the law to block people based on their race. And when it came to voting, Jim Crow laws never explicitly used the term race. Instead, it looked at behaviors or practices that were used primarily by or were predominantly used by communities of color and said, okay, we're going to stop you from being able to do those activities, but we're never going to say it's because you're Black. We're just going to say these activities are things you cannot do, or here are things we're going to make you do in order to participate. And we all use this phrase that we don't really understand the origin of often. When we say we grandfather something in, that comes about from the Mississippi plan that created Jim Crow. And what they said was, when it comes to voting, we're going to put all of these things in place: poll taxes, literacy tests, making you count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap. And everyone's going to have to do it unless your grandfather was legally eligible to vote prior to the Civil War. Well, in the South, if you were white, that's everyone. And if you're Black, that's no one. And that's how you have racially neutral, seemingly innocuous laws that affect everyone equally. But the reality is it doesn't affect everyone equally because it targets behavior that some can escape and others can't. And so what we're seeing happen on the side of right, and this is not a partisan issue for me, this is about democracy, because in New Hampshire, they tried to pass a law that would stop students from being able to vote. New Hampshire is not known as a hotbed of liberal values, nor is it predominantly a state that has a large community of color. And so we have to stop this notion that voter suppression is only about communities of color. Largely, communities of color are the initial target because we happen to have the greatest proliferation and the most easily discerned likely political leanings. But when they break democracy, they're coming after everyone who does not agree with their policies. And so even if you may not be an initial target, what's happening with the uniformity of the bills that are being pushed to deny access to the right to vote we're just not keeping pace, because often the states where communities of color are most at risk are also states that have a trifecta or a tendency to have more Republican leadership. 57% of Black people in America live in the South. And there are only 3 states in the South that have governors who tend towards the political leanings of people of color, which would be Democratic. I know this is a nonpartisan organization, but this is not about partisanship. This is just the facts. And because of the nexus between the right to vote and who we elect, we often see a conflation of the two. But my issue is who we get to pick should not determine how we get to participate. Mm-hmm. I get to have the same right to go into the voting booth and make my choice as the next person. But when you harm my ability to even participate, you negate my ability to make my selection.
You know what? I think this is, Stacey, is actually the most important thing to focus on right now when you're talking about the creation of barriers. And as a union, as a labor movement, we really support the idea that everybody's voice counts, right? That's what we fight for. So talk to us about, our members are listening. What can we do to be able, again, to really support and break down those barriers? What can we do to really make sure that everybody's voices count and that we can participate in making that a reality?
So the first piece is volume. If everyone closes their eyes and remembers the 2016 election, or let's go back to 2000, voter suppression never disappeared. It went underground as long as we had the Voting Rights Act. And when the Voting Rights Act was gutted in 2013, the Supreme Court basically said that the formula that was used to protect the right to vote, this landmark law, that the formula was wrong. What they said was, well, the formula is wrong, and so until you can fix the formula, you don't get to use the law. Well, that happened in 2013, where there was not a lot of interest, if you remember the political dynamic, in fixing the formula. And so within hours of that law's passage, within hours, the state of Texas passed the most restrictive voter identification laws in their history. And so we knew that it was going to begin, but people didn't talk about it very much. There was low-level chatter. If you were affected directly by it, people were talking about voter suppression, but most people in America did not think of voter suppression. When we had the 2016 election, so much attention was paid to foreign interference. There was less conversation about the fact that that was the first presidential election that we held after the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act. So a number of states that had been held back from voter suppression, they let the floodgates just rip open. And hundreds of thousands of Americans, millions even, were denied access to the right to vote, or they faced barriers to voting that we had not noticed. So the first and most important difference between then and 2020 is that we talk about it. When we give voice to the pain and to the barriers that people face, things change. Unions are so important because they give volume to individual grievance, individual harm. And the same thing is true about fighting voter suppression. We have to talk about these bills, because what the other side is hoping for, those who are proliferators of voter suppression, they hope that it all just dies down, that we just stop talking about it, let it flare up for a couple of minutes or a couple of weeks, and then let's go back to our business. But we can't get back to our business if our fellow citizens are denied their rights to vote. And so our first job is volume. We have to keep talking about it and keep it front and center and not let it fade from the public conversation. Second, we have to support those who are fighting for voting rights. And the reality is, it's a very clear test. Are you seeking to expand access for eligible citizens to participate in our elections, or are you seeking to restrict access from eligible citizens in participation? If they're seeking to expand it, they're voting rights. If they're seeking to restrict it, they're voter suppressors. Pretty simple dynamic. So support those who are trying to expand it, and do it where you are, because voter suppression happens at both the national level, but it also happens at the hyper-local level. It can be a lack of access of language. It can be financial barriers. And so figure out the problem that matters to you. And there are great organizations like the Brennan Center and the Leadership Conference that can tell you, these are all 501c3 nonpartisan organizations. They can give you information about where else to go. And then the third thing we have to do is support federal legislation. If you go back to what I said earlier about 47 states passing these laws, and they'll pass in some places, they'll fail in other places. We have 50 different democracies in the United States at any given moment. The quality of your citizenship, as determined by democracy, depends on your geography. That should not happen in this country. And so we need federal standards that set a baseline, a threshold, so that no matter where you live, the quality of your democracy, at least when it comes to your ability to register, to stay on the rolls, and to cast your ballot, is the same. And that's the For the People Act, S1, HR1, and that's the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, or HR4. Passage of those federal bills, those voting rights provisions, will change the quality of democracy and guarantee a threshold, but it will also preclude states from going back and trying to change things again once those laws have passed.
Thank you. I have one other question, David. Just, if you don't mind, I just want it, because it segues for me in this, is that when you're talking about the things that we can do, people are talking about the boycott. Can you talk about that? Because I think it's a very important conversation regarding, is it effective? Is that the thing that we need to be doing?
Boycotts have a strong and important history in pushing for civil rights, for human rights. And it is disingenuous for anyone to say that boycotts do not work. I don't say that. In fact, it was the first line in my op-ed. But what we have to understand is how it works as a strategy. The Montgomery bus boycott did not just happen out of thin air. It was strategized for months, and it was planned. And they had backup plans to their backup plans. The people who were going to be affected knew what the implications were, and they agreed to those challenges. And it took 381 days, and it was only ended because of a Supreme Court case that solved the problem. The North Carolina boycott is probably the most recent one people remember. And what happened there was that the NCAA threatened to pull out. The bill was signed, and this was the bathroom bill that was signed in North Carolina. It was signed during an election year. And if you remember, Hillary Clinton lost, Kay Hagan lost. The only person who won that election was the person who was running against the guy who signed the bill, and that was Roy Cooper. And even then, the Republican legislature refused to repeal the bill. It took another year before they actually had the outcome that they sought. But attention shifted, and so people thought everything was fine. Boycotts take time, and we are dealing with the immediacy and the urgency of voting rights. And so as a strategic imperative, I do not support boycotts in Georgia yet, because we know that the change in dynamics and the investment in the communities that are most at risk are coming from those who come and stay in Georgia, who invest in Georgia, who support Georgia. What has happened for so long in the South in particular is that when people become outraged by the bad behavior, they leave and take those values with them. And if you're going to leave the victims behind, you are leaving them to their own devices. My preference is that we stand together as a nation, and that those who share our values, those who are facing the victimization and the oppression, that you come and join us in our fight. We want you here. We want you standing up with us. We want you investing with us. We want you amplifying us. I am the daughter of two pastors. I am friends with the faith leaders who are leading these calls, and I will never, ever diminish the legitimacy of their passion and their intent. I just disagree that I think it is not the most effective strategy. I think it is more effective to stay and fight, to amplify, and to invest.
So that's
does that mean when the baseball league pulls the All-Star game off, which is a financial action, but it's also a symbolic action, or when CEOs are coming out and stating that they may take their conventions elsewhere or their business elsewhere, is your response the same, that can be counterproductive as opposed to productive?
I think it can be harmful. I'm not saying counterproductive, because counterproductive is a different framing. It is harmful to the people you're seeking to help, but the message is important. And the message that the MLB sent, I may disagree with how they sent it, but the message was right. What you are doing here is not good. What you are doing here is anathema to who we intend to be, and we will not support it. I just wish they could have done it a different way. And for the conventions, I would rather, if you're going to come here, you need to tell us that you're coming to support the fight for voting rights. I do not want you to come here in silence. If you're coming in silence, you don't need to be here. If you think that what's happening should be left to the internal devices, then you're ignoring the fact that we are all one nation, and that every state's voices matter in the terms of the direction of our nation. And so I want people who come to speak out when they come, to talk about why this is a problem, and to commit to doing right, to correct what is wrong.
I love that. I do. And I thought it was really interesting when you said about a boycott. It's the most effective is when everybody agrees to the challenges that they'll be faced with. And that's not happening right now. So I really thank you for that messaging. I know Rebecca is with us right now. Rebecca, are you here? There you go.
I am.
This has been great. We just have a few questions. We want to be so mindful of your being with us today. It's really, I know your schedule is quite busy, but we just have a few questions that came out from some of our members. Rebecca, why don't you go for it?
Yes. So there are so many good questions that came in. So I'm just going to grab a couple here. The 361 bills in 47 states that have been introduced in November. And that is just, almost everywhere. People are always curious, how can they help to get into the process and make sure that bills are submitted to not restrict voting access?
So the most important way is to be in touch with your state legislature. And this goes back to David's question. The uniformity of these laws, the intent is clear. The intent is to limit who can vote early, to limit access to absentee ballots, to limit the ease of submitting your vote, the drop boxes and mobile voting, to the drive-through voting, which is what they had in Texas that was so effective. They want to limit ways that increase the likelihood that more people participate. And so your mission should be to ask your representatives, your Senate or your House member. And if you don't have one that's listening, find someone who will and ask them to introduce counter legislation. The reality is that in many of our states, Democrats either control everything or Republicans control everything. I think right now, Republicans have 23, they call them trifectas. That means they hold the House, the Senate, and the governorship. I think Democrats are at like 20, 21. And then you've got a number of states where it's a competitive, or you just have Nebraska, which is a unicameral legislature, and I'm going way into the weeds. Anyway, my point being,
I'm from Nebraska, so I know unicameral. There you go. Go for it.
So you don't have a trifecta, you just have a fecta, a bifecta. But the point would be that the goal is to make certain that you are in conversation with your state legislature. I was a state legislator for 11 years, and those who wanted things, who showed up, were so much more likely to see change happen. But we tend to either focus our attention on the federal level or on the hyper local level. But most of the things you either like or don't like happen at the state level. And so being aware of and engaged at the state level is critical. And then the other piece is that if you go to stopjimcrow2.com, that's the website we set up that's really providing information about what's happening in Georgia and around the country. And if you sign up with us, we can send you updates so you learn more about what's happening. This is being run by Fair Fight Action, which is a 501c4 nonpartisan organization. So it is only about voting rights. And if you sign up with us, we can tell you about voting rights opportunities and who's doing what with these bills.
Yay, education, education, education. Just reiterating what you said was so important. One of those, the main pillars. Another question that came in is, I read that voters can get free IDs in every state that requires them for voting. Is this true?
No, it is. First of all, the free ID is a misnomer, because while they may not charge you to take your picture, they're going to charge, someone's going to charge you for the birth certificate. They're going to charge you for you're going to have to pay for the gas. There are costs that are included. And when you are someone who has not been able to secure an ID, it is usually because the costs are so prohibitive that you instead live your life with more difficulty because meeting those obligations are too costly. The other piece I will put in there is that for anyone who was born during the Jim Crow era, and let's remember, that's basically since the end of slavery through 1965, essentially, there were a number of states where you could not be born in a hospital, which meant you never received a birth certificate. You would still have some record of your birth that would allow you to eventually apply for a social security number. But that does not mean that you have an automatic right to a birth certificate. And we know of people who, in fact, in Wisconsin, there was a federal court case because a woman who'd voted for almost 40 years, when Wisconsin changed their voter ID laws and required that she have to prove her birth because she was born during Jim Crow, for the first time since the end of Jim Crow, she was not allowed to vote because she legally could not get a birth certificate because her parents were not permitted to have one. And so it's things like that that we let recede into our memory, and we forget that Jim Crow was not that long ago. My maternal grandfather was born in 1887. And so we should not convince ourselves that these things are so far back and so far away that they don't have a current effect.
We're going to go for, thank you for that. Rebecca, do you have another question? And then I think, David, you had something you wanted to ask?
Yeah, several members wrote in about winning the inaugural Social Justice Impact Award. So congratulations for that at the NAACP Image Awards 2021 this year. And there's also news out about you being nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize to be announced later October this year. What does that nomination mean to you? And what do you think that means for voting rights?
I am deeply honored that the parliamentarian in Norway who put forward my nomination thought enough of the work and of what we were able to accomplish that he thought it worthy of nomination. I think there are people who are doing work that is so much more important, and I think it is critical and a reflection of the importance of protecting our democracy that someone in Norway would lift up my name as an avatar for what we are doing. And so I'm honored by that, but I also think we have to keep remembering why we fight for democracy. It's so that we can have an effect on so many other challenges that face our nation and that face our world.
Beautiful. David?
Yes, we can't let you leave without talking about the Derek Chauvin verdict, and just getting your opinion about the question. The way that I frame it, is this a moment that serves as a launch pad for more justice in the area of state brutality against Black and other people? Is this just a blip? There are some people who are very excited about it, some people who are not excited about it. And for most of us who pay attention to progressive issues, these dots connect. They connect to voting rights. They connect to suppression. These are all related. Just love your take on that.
I think accountability rather than justice is the appropriate language to use here. And I think we should always celebrate moments of accountability, particularly when so much that preceded it demonstrated or signaled that accountability would not happen. The outcome of the Breonna Taylor case did not signal that we should expect accountability. Philando Castile did not signal. This is the first time in Minnesota history that a white police officer was convicted of murder in the death of a Black citizen. And so we should acknowledge the relief and the importance of accountability being a metric that we can look to as a proof point. But it is one proof point. In Georgia, we are still awaiting the Ahmaud Arbery trial, 2 men who murdered a young man jogging in the streets. And so we have to, and we still have to understand what happened to Adam Toledo and what happened to Ma'Khia Bryant. We cannot rest on this notion that good is done because good happened once. And in this case, the good was that we saw the process we were told to trust actually play out to its conclusion. But there is no good to be found in the murders of our fellow citizens. There is no good to be found in the constancy of fear. There is no good to be found that since the day that trial began, I heard today on NPR, at least one person has been killed in police custody every single day. Yep. And regardless of who we are and what we look like, we should be able to expect that law enforcement is there for our protection and our defense. And I celebrate those who would stand up and risk their lives for others. But that sacrifice has to also be met with accountability and responsibility. And we need to have a nation state that allows us to see clearly the difference between those who make hard choices in defense of our protection and those who make choices because of their own prejudices or their lack of training or their lack of compassion or their lack of humanity. And until we can create a clear separation or at least a clear process for accountability, then we are going to have to continue to pursue the call for justice and the call for accountability every day.
We must be better. That's
really wonderful.
Really,
thank you for that.
Thank you so much. I just want to, we're going to be wrapping up right now, but there are 3 things that you mentioned, and I want to remind our members who are listening on how we can participate. How can we make a difference? 1, talk about it. Talk about it. I'm just reiterating what you said. Number 2, support those who are fighting for all of us and for our rights. And 3, support federal legislation. So those are 3 active things that our members can really do to help guide and move into the future and not make it a one-time thing, but to really go and make sure that everybody's voices are heard. I really cannot say enough how wonderful it was to have you here today. It's been a great discussion. It's a pleasure having everybody join us. A special thanks to each of you who have been tuning in every week for the President's Task Force on Education Outreach and Engagement live streams. If you haven't already, while you're here, you can subscribe to SAG-AFTRA's YouTube channel to get updates on the great content that we're posting. I want to thank you again and everybody who brought in questions, the people who've been here to listen. David, wonderful, having you here co-hosting together, and Rebecca, and of course, Stacey. Thank you so much for this time.